Latinos. Oraz gra o polskich? Gra o polskich czołgach.
Thus, much of Japan's rearmament program, and in particular research into chemical and
Magicowi.
peace initiative, spurred on by a culture that was increasingly militaristic in nature, inspired by the old ways of the Japanese samurai and the way of the warrior. Similarly, Italy, too, was undergoing something of an ideological revolution, hoping to recapture past glory and establish a new international identity as a
Dobra, idziemy, tam widzę jaki pojazd.
In 1922, Mussolini,
Kurwa, prawie.
National Fascist Party, rose to power in Italy. Very soon, he
Sektor
began
A.
reshaping the democratic political landscape
Kurwa, obok.
into a dictatorship centered around himself. Mussolini believed his new
Ja pierdolę, masz dalej.
was to birth a new Roman Empire. He began a massive build-up of armed forces. A difficult task, given that Italy's economy
Kurwa,
was
uciekł mi z
still
boku.
largely centered around agriculture.
Jebany śmieć.
Manufacturing base he needed for such grand plans. With both nations now ready to undertake their ambitions, conflict was inevitable. History records the Second World War began in 1939. However, some historians now argue that it began in 1931 with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria from China and efforts to
Ja
supply resources. The Japanese deliberately detonated a bomb on a Chinese railway line used by Japanese citizens in order to blame it on Chinese dissidents. This was then used as a pretext to ceaseless war with the Chinese governments all the while. Japanese occupation of Chinese territory was extraordinarily harsh. Rape and murder were not only widespread but often encouraged by the Japanese leadership as a form of recreation for the troops. In Japanese society, surrender was unthinkable, for it would dishonor one's family, and they applied this code upon the Chinese as well. Chinese prisoners who did not fight to the death were treated brutally, either being murdered on the spot or worse to death, while a few particularly unlucky victims might find themselves sent to one of Japan's medical research facilities that had been built in occupied China. Situated at Pingfan in northeast China and designated Unit 731, thousands of Chinese prisoners were used in nightmarish medical experiments to develop biological and chemical weapons, as well as carry out experimental surgeries, often without...
Ja pierdolę, no. Tak strzelić chujowo.
The goods. Mussolini, too, was not afraid to use his forces to build his empire, most notably when he sent troops into Abyssinia, modern-day Ethiopia, in 1935, to start the construction of the new Roman Empire in Africa. If a case can be made for Manchuria being considered the first battlefront of World War II, then Abyssinia could be the second. Of course, it was the third fascist country to emerge that would become the premier player in this story. Germany, under Adolf Hitler. Hitler was himself of Austrian birth, but had fought in the and like many in Europe, he feared communism spreading beyond the borders of post-revolutionary Russia. In 1919, a year after the end of the war, he joined a new and unknown political group called the German Workers' Party and used his great ability as a speaker to stir up crowds and gain support. A year later, the party was renamed to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, more commonly known by its English abbreviation, Nazi. In 1921, Hitler rose to become the leader of the party, and again, using his magnetic personality, continued to garner more and more support, until in 1923, the Nazis were confident enough to attempt a coup in Munich and seize power. Known as the Beer Hall Putsch, the effort failed, and Hitler was arrested before being put on trial, but this only furthered the Nazi cause. Hitler used the trial to gain even more supporters, despite spending a year in prison, in which he wrote his autobiography, Mein Kampf. The Nazis struggled to establish themselves in German politics. Mein Kampf not only outlined Hitler's own story, but it also set about establishing his vision of the future of the German people, and how he believed subversive groups were holding him from achieving their destiny.
Marcin!
Measures such as the Treaty of Versailles, which outlined Germany's surrender terms. He specifically identified Jews and communists as being the leaders of this great international conspiracy to keep the German people down after the war, highlighting the harsh conditions imposed on the country by the victorious Allies. The book effectively became the Nazi Bible. By 1933, the Nazi Party had secured enough political support that Hitler legally became Chancellor of Germany. He quickly began passing legislation that would transform Germany into Nazi Germany, and the swastika would symbolize this reinvigorated country. Persecution of Jews, gypsies, and political opponents soon became government policy,
Ja pierdolę.
preparing Nazi Germany to attain what him as the undisputed Führer.
Beko, zainspirowany naturą, zapewniło idealny rozkład ciepła i pary w swoich nowych piekarnikach. Za każdym razem dostarczając idealnych rezultatów pieczenia. Piekarniki parowe Beko Aero Perfect.
As the 1930s drew on, Hitler's Nazi Party became firmly embedded, not just in German politics, but German society. The German people had much to thank the Nazi Party for, since they had pulled the country out of the despair of defeat and reinvigorated it, promising that Germany would soon be attaining its destiny of becoming a great power again. Hitler's appeal and influence was not lost on foreign observers, many of whom admired him and even began to sympathize with the treatment of Germany after the war. Hitler would even become Time magazine's Man of the Year. This played perfectly into Hitler's hand, as he began making notions of regaining lost territory in the east and west of the country. The first test of how the Allied powers of Britain and France would respond to his new Germany came in 1935, when Hitler introduced military conscription, which saw the German armed forces swell many times beyond the number permitted by the Treaty of Versailles. However, the Allies did nothing. Encouraged by this, he then ordered his troops into the Rhineland in 1936. The Rhineland had been demilitarized in 1925 in order to create a safety zone for France, who, along with Belgium, had occupied it for a time due to Germany's inability to pay war reparations. Hitler had given secret orders to his men that should they encounter French military resistance, they were to retreat, because Germany was still in no condition to fight a war. But despite protests from France at the League of Nations, the wider world did nothing. Hitler also joined Mussolini in sending troops to fight for the nationalists in the Spanish Civil War, giving his forces vital combat experience. In 1937, British Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin stood down and was succeeded by Neville Chamberlain. Meanwhile, Germany continued to rearm and now set their sights on reclaiming the German Sudetenland, which had been absorbed into Czechoslovakia after the war. At the same time, Hitler looked to his own birth country of Austria to become a part of his new Germany, although this was again forbidden by the Versailles Treaty. Austria and Germany had long had an almost symbiotic relationship, and both countries' peoples viewed the other as cousins. Austria even had its own Nazi party, and in January of 1938, they attempted their own putsch, much like Hitler had tried back in 1923. The putsch failed, and many leading Austrian Nazis were imprisoned. Hitler's propaganda machine went to work, creating a false impression that Austrians were rising up in support of their imprisoned Nazis, and so on March 12, 1938, German troops entered Austrian territory on the pretense of restoring order. Within weeks, the Austrian government was gone, and the country was absorbed into Germany as the province of Ostmark. A vote on joining Germany claimed that 99% of the population supported the move, which was known as the Anschluss. Having secured his home nation under a Greater Germany, Hitler declared himself the advocate of all ethnic Germans in Europe, and primarily of those in the Sudetenland. Making clear his intention to absorb the region into Germany, a diplomatic crisis was sparked when, just like in Austria, a Sudetenland Nazi party rose up and began demanding autonomy from Czechoslovakia. The Czech government tried to negotiate with the Sudeten Germans, while a series of meetings were held between Germany, Britain, and France to reach an agreement on the crisis, culminating in the Munich Agreement, which effectively gave a free hand to Germany's ambitions. No Czech representative was present. First, Hitler took the Sudetenland, and then in January of 1939, he invaded and captured the rest of Czechoslovakia in his first act of truly open aggression towards a neighbor. The conquest of Czechoslovakia raised concerns with the mighty Soviet Union, which was in the grip of the paranoid Joseph Stalin. Hitler had written in Mein Kampf that having to fight a war on two fronts was one of the reasons that the Kaiser's Germany was defeated, and so having already antagonized London and Paris, he was far more careful with Moscow and began a diplomatic effort with the Soviet Union to keep them out of events in the West. In August 1939, the German and Soviet foreign ministers met in Moscow, where the pair effectively divided Eastern Europe up into two, on the promise that neither would interfere with the other in those areas. The Soviet Union had its own interests in Poland and Finland, and so was happy to abide by the agreement, even though Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union were ideological enemies. Despite this period of cooperation, many felt it wouldn't last, but with Stalin at bay, Hitler ordered his troops into Poland on September 1st, 1939.
Tak, wszystkie zęby piękne są. Pokaż więc swoje, śmiało, kamon.
The invasion of Poland was the final straw for Britain and France. There was no justification for the invasion other than to simply capture territory from a foreign land, and so the Allied powers delivered an ultimatum to Hitler: withdraw his troops or there would be war. The demand was refused, and on September 3rd, Neville Chamberlain told the British people that they were at war with Germany. Some of Germany's more cautious generals had warned Hitler that the country was not yet ready for a second massive European confrontation. Germany's rearmament plans predicted war with Britain and France breaking out in 1945, by which time they would have their own aircraft power, large U-boat fleets, and powerful tank forces. The generals, therefore, concocted their Blitzkrieg style of war. Blitzkrieg means lightning, and called for the widespread use of tanks and aircraft to break through enemy formations,
Gra polski?
strategic areas, and divide
Druga,
enemy
właśnie.
up to make it easier to destroy. Above all, it was intended to achieve a quick victory rather than a drawn-out war of attrition, which Germany could not afford. It was first used in Poland, and the Polish army proved totally inadequate to this new form of warfare. In less than a month, the Polish army was annihilated, and Germany, the Wehrmacht, began consolidating their positions in western Poland as the Soviet Union invaded the rest of the country on September 17th, as had been agreed to by Stalin and Hitler.
Widziałem gra polski?
It was all but ignored by Britain and France,
Gra
who
polski?
concentrated on
Druga.
Germany. Poland ceased to exist as a free country on October 6, 1939, and Nazi Germany now shared a land border with the communists.
Kurwa mać.
Britain and France's declaration of war across Europe, but appeared to do very little else. Belgium, Holland, and Norway joined a chorus of European voices declaring themselves neutral in the fighting, but in fact there seemed to be very little fighting at all. In terms of helping to defend Poland, Britain and France could do very little. Instead, they prepared for when Hitler would charge.
Ładuj, wsypuję
This was the
śmieć.
start of the Cold War,
Ostatnia.
a period where both sides seemed to be doing everything they would normally do in war, except all-out warfare. The French mobilized their armed forces and sent them to the border, while Britain created the British Expeditionary Force, or BEF, to be sent across the Channel to support France, mirroring how the country went to war in 1914. At sea, German U-boats and surface raiders did sink unprotected merchant ships, while in the air, British aircraft made attacks on German shipping or conducted leaflet drops over the Ruhr region. During one such leaflet dropping mission on September 9th, a formation of RAF Whitley bombers strayed into Belgian airspace and were attacked by Belgian fighters, which forced one of them to land, but they did lose 2 aircraft to British defensive fire. However, in the South Atlantic, a drama was about to unfold that would become a naval legend. The German pocket battleship Gaspé was attacking British merchant ships, capturing their crews and then sinking. The crews were then put on the Graf Spee support ship, the Alpine, for returning to Germany. 3 British cruisers met the German ship in battle, and despite being outgunned, managed to inflict enough damage to force the German battleship to put into port for repairs. While there, the British began flooding the local media sources that a huge British armada was assembled to destroy the pocket battleship when it left port.
Kurde, trafienie, ale jeszcze żyje, skurwiel.
And the media situation was hopeless, scuffling to Russia. In reality, there was no armada, but the deception meant potentially thousands of sailors were slaughtered. A few weeks later, British Special Forces raided the Armada and everyone knew the phony war couldn't last forever, and it would only be a matter of time before Hitler struck west at France. In the meantime, Britain and France decided to embark on a campaign in Norway, at the time a neutral country, but one that along with Sweden helped supply Germany with vital iron ore. The Allies mined Norwegian arms from where German ships operated, which provoked Hitler to send his forces in on April 9th to secure them. At the same time, Hitler's forces struck at Denmark, taking the country in less than 6 hours. The battle for Norway would last until June 10th, by which time France and Britain had long retreated, leaving the country to its fate. But in doing so, effectively suspended British democracy for the foreseeable future. He told the British people rather bluntly that he had nothing to offer them but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. Across the Channel, the French had been preparing for another great war against Germany for over a decade by constructing the Maginot Line, a series of brutally tough fortifications along the border with Germany. It was designed and constructed in the belief that the war would be reminiscent of the static nature of World War I, but it was fundamentally flawed. It only went as far north as the Belgian border, and despite popular belief at the time, it was not a continuous fortification, having several gaps where it was believed that natural obstacles such as forests and hills would provide protection. It also consumed huge amounts of men and resources, leaving some to worry the French were putting all their eggs into one basket as far as defense of their nation was concerned. Hitler looked at the situation and immediately saw what had to be done. He was simply going to bypass it entirely by going through Belgium and Holland. Like the Kaiser before in 1914, he paid little interest to Belgium's or anyone else's declaration of neutrality if it served his purpose. On May 10th of 1940, Germany struck west, quickly overrunning Belgium, Luxembourg and the Netherlands, and turning in towards the heart of France. All the Maginot Line had achieved was to swell the fighting into neighbouring countries and effectively hand even more of Europe to Hitler. The Germans flooded France, making good use of their tank and air forces, despite being outnumbered on paper. Indeed, Germany's tank forces were in many ways technologically inferior to the Allies in 1940, but the Germans had far superior tactics. In the air, the British and French found themselves heavily outclassed by the vaunted German Messerschmitt and sustained heavy losses, but it would be another German plane that would get Stuka was a famed dive bomber that could attack tanks and bridges with extraordinary accuracy and potency, striking terror into German units. Later, the aircraft would be fitted with a siren in its wings that would create a terrifying howl when it entered a dive, to further frighten troops, making it as much a psychological weapon as a bomber. To compound problems for the Allies, the quick German success and the failure of the Maginot Line to keep Hitler's forces at bay saw French morale in particular suffer terribly. Despite spirited resistance